Hello. I'm back for chapter 13. Here we go. My mother had expected a wedding proposal. Instead, she found me in tears, hunched over my tepid cup of tea. She rushed to my side and curled her arms around me and crooned in my ear, "Oh, duckling, oh, my poor Harry. Never you mind that horrid little man. You will make a fine spinster. You love doggies, do you not? Dogs and books to your heart's content. And your papa is fond of reminding us all will be sorted in the end." I hugged her close, and when my sobs eventually mellowed, she pulled a kerchief from her sleeve and gave it to me to wipe away my tears. "I'm not worried about my status," I replied. "Mr. Blackwood is the least of my concerns. I'm frustrated by this horrible situation, Mamma." I took a deep, shuddering breath. "I fear one of our friends or relations has been co-opted into lunacy, and I'm terrified to find out who. No one is quite what they seem." "What the dickens are you talking about?" she said, concerned. "Mr. Posey, Mamma," I replied. "What happened to his sons is happening again." "Oh dear," she said, holding her hands to her mouth. "Oh mercy, not again." "What was Mr. Posey like? You knew him before his descent into madness. Was there any hint of his violent character?" Grief washed over her. "Oh no, dear, not at all. Mr. Posey was the very model of a fine and educated gentleman. He always seemed so rational, so logical, right up until the end. It frightened me when they took him off to Broadmoor because he and your father were two peas in a pod they were. Whatever faults Mr. Posey suffered, I was afraid your father might share." She patted my hand. "But we are blessed that your father is of sterner stuff and did not falter or fall under the influence of his friend's lunacy. If you wish to know the details of Mr. Posey's character, then you must talk with your father. He'll be able to give you a perspective where I cannot." She shook her head sadly. "Of the couple I knew Mrs. Posey better, but she was a dour woman with very little lightness of spirit. I don't think there was much love between them, and they spent most of their time on opposite ends of Northwich Hall, avoiding the other completely. They would dine with us fortnightly, but the evening was often dull." "And the sons?" I said. "Oh, odious, all three of them," she replied. "A noxious combination of their mother's dreary disposition and their father's strict temperament. I'm not surprised they fell to ruin. They had a weakness of the mind, Harry, that spoke of inbreeding and pollution." How much had the boys been influenced by the pernicious vapors of their father's evil library? We Lovecraft girls had managed to mold our talents into useful skills, but then again we enjoyed a bit of distance from the offending books. The Posey boys would have been surrounded by cursed books. Their situation would have been quite inescapable. "Did they read?" I asked. "The Posey boys?" said my mother. "Oh, goodness, no! They were not very bright, I'm afraid. I remember once your father saying that the boys had never been taught to read." "So they didn't share Mr. Posey's love of books?" "Oh, their only love they had was for impishness," Mamma said. She dropped her voice low. "For the most part, harmless pranks, you know, dropping pants or giving each other a fishy." She brought up her index fingers and jabbed them forward, as if to stab someone up the backside. "Whenever they visited for dinner, they were always swapping out the sugar for salt when no one was looking." "A nuisance, then," I said. "Oh, as most boys are, if they are spirited and unsupervised." She waggled her hands to the window overlooking the garden. "But ask your father, Harry. He'll know better than I." And so I went out to the garden, where father was tending his beloved bees. He saw the perplexed expression on my face and ushered me over to the bench by the door, where we could sit together in a shaft of warm sunlight. "I can infer that Mr. Blackwood's visit did not go as your mother planned," he said. "I have no interest in marriage, nor does he," I replied. "Oh, thank goodness for that," Papa said with great relief. I took my father's hand in mine and felt the rising concern in his affections. "You have always been honest with me, haven't you?" I said. "You're the most sensible of my daughters, Harriet," he replied with furrowed brow. "I've never felt that there was a topic we should avoid. Why would you ask now?" I took a deep breath. "Mr. Blackwood told me of Mr. Posey's library, and I've come to ask you about the man you once called your friend." My father looked to the ground, as he often did when sorting his thoughts. When he began to speak, his voice was low but clear. He spoke as though he had often wished to talk of Mr. Posey, but had suppressed the impulse for a very long time. The words flowed out like water bursting from a broken dam, a powerful cataract that was, at first, rushed and eager, then measured and paced and confident. John was a good man, a very interesting man, who possessed a boundless curiosity for the world. His family had a long and an illustrious lineage, and he spent his family wealth in the search for answers to questions that mortal men ought not to ask. My father smiled. I was a professor of history for many years, but John's knowledge was far superior to mine. My education had come from lectures and essays, but his research had led him to foreign lands and exotic cities, to ruins on the edge of the known world, and his library reflected the treasures he'd found in those far-flung places. Oh, how he loved books. He hoarded them as a dragon hoards treasure. He knew the place of every single title on the shelf, and it didn't seem to matter how many hundreds of volumes he possessed. He knew the contents and condition of every one, and always wanted more. Mr. Blackwood claims the books are dangerous, I said. Not all of them, said Papa. Most are full of wondrous stories, nothing else. But? Papa tipped his head to one side. There are some that are more than mere books, Harry. I have seen a few of them, but John would not let me touch them, never mind read from them. He claimed that 3 in particular were of a treacherous nature. He laid his elbows on his knees and looked towards the horizon, focusing on some distant point in his memory. Let me see if I can remember the titles. Ah, yes, The Final Confessions of Bai Ji, concubine to the Yellow Emperors. That was one of them. There was also The Widow's Rights, which he had uncovered on the slopes of the Himalayas and purchased from an old yak herder. Oh, and Songs of the Scented Gardens. That was a particularly frightful one, if I remember correctly. It sounds lovely, I replied. He shook his head. Dangerous, and made more dangerous by its beauty. I remember seeing that one, though I was forbidden to lay a finger upon it. The volume was hypnotic, edged with gold, bound in albino human skin. He whistled low. It was as seductive as a siren, calling to Jason and his Argonauts. It practically hummed with unearthly power. And you knew of these books, I said, sitting for years in an abandoned house, yet did nothing? What could I do? He said with a shrug. The village council locked up the estate, and I figured they were as safe there as anywhere else in the world. At least I knew they hadn't fallen into the hands of a tyrant. He grinned. As the years passed, I thought less and less about them. I hoped they'd rot, I suppose. I hoped they'd succumb to moisture and mildew and vanish from the world forever. He shook his head. But now they are Blackwoods. Do we trust a man like that with such power, especially if he knows their full value? I thought on this question. Mr. Blackwood has a greedy and self-serving disposition, and a boundless ambition that drives him, but I don't think he's without a conscience. I laid my hand upon him, Papa, and I didn't feel that he was evil, only misguided. Perhaps he was once a good soul, but he's been spoiled by circumstance. I looked to my father, and noticed for the first time that his face belonged to an old man, and most of his hair had turned white and wispy. His chin was more sharply pointed, his eyes sunken into hollows, his skin as frail and translucent as tissue paper. Through his hand in mine, I felt the soft sensation of relief percolating through his fingers, as well as the happy quietude of nostalgia. I said in a whisper, Mrs. Darling said that Mr. Posey had been digging a well when he uncovered a portal to hell, and the Posey boys tumbled down the well into that infernal underworld, only to return as demons, and Mr. Posey was forced to kill them. Is that true? The spot between his hoary eyebrows furrowed in thought. Well, isn't that an interesting interpretation? But is it the truth? I pressed. My father shook his head. No one knows the truth, Harry. Once the Posies had children, John was so afraid to have such perilous items in his possession that he dug a hole in the cellar to bury the books. He threw them down into the abyss and covered it over with paving stones. He looked out to the fields. But perhaps the boys were curious, and the books did not wish to remain hidden. Maybe they called out in dreams and visions. His face turned towards that great hulk of a house, poised like a sentinel in the distance. Maybe the boys climbed down into the pit and read passages from those foul volumes, until the things that crawled back up into the light were no longer the Posey children, but something foul and sinister. Maybe they ate their mother up, and they would have eaten John too, and escaped into the northern forests if he hadn't destroyed them. He looked back to me. All of this is fanciful conjecture, Harry. I don't know the truth. No one does. But one night, whatever the circumstance, John bludgeoned his sons to death with a silver mace, pushed their corpses down into the well, and set fire to them, then sealed their unholy remains behind a big oak door bound with iron. I'd seen the door myself in the cellar of Northwich. A skitter of terror travelled up my spine. You believe this? Papa gave another shrug. It was John's final confession to me before he was bundled off to Broadmoor Asylum. John believed it, and that was good enough for me. And the books? I know not what happened to them. I figured John had burned them in the fires or hidden them on the property. He went mad. One could no longer trust his perceptions. When Dr. Gelder committed him, John refused to speak to me again. I thought for a moment of the titles on the shelf, and none matched the 3 my father had warned against, but one title sprang to mind. I did look at one of Mr. Posie's books, I admitted, but it was quite strange and not at all what I expected. I thought it would be architecture, but instead it was anatomy. I cast my mind back. I believe it was entitled A Treatise on the Use and Practice of Building Rights. My father's eyes widened and he leaned forward. Did you read it? I only looked at a few of the plates before I was distracted, I said. They looked more like a doctor's manual than building plans. Building rights, he mused. Neither architecture, nor anatomy, nor superstition, but a mix of the 3. Harry, building rights are ceremonies used to ensure the stability of a foundation. Coins, statues, little slips of paper, any of those will work. They're set into the cornerstone of a church, or pushed into the concrete of a foundation to ensure the building is blessed. He shook his head in wonder. But given your description, it seems Posie's book was a guide to the most ancient of rites, when a coin or a statue would not do. It is a very old custom, known throughout the world. The Japanese call it hirobashiri. The Maori call it raukakai. The Babylonians called it takpertum. The old gods demanded blood, my love. They were never content with symbols. They wanted a living creature to be sealed in the foundation, so that the spirit of the dead could guard the building for all time. No one ever did such a thing, I exclaimed. No, said my father. I'm sure the myth is not without roots. So the story goes, our own St. Dismas church in Dunham had a black terrier pup buried in its cornerstone, and on moonlit nights you can hear the thing yapping. You speak of the Grimm, I said. I do. I thought that was just a story to scare Emma. Stories have their roots in many truths, Papa said. Was Earl not bound up in the wood of a bridge? Perhaps the old gods have returned and want their share of blood once more. He shook his head. These are sad and unsettling times, Harry, and we must be open to all manner of strange things if we hope to survive them. He squeezed my hand and said, I'm not a religious man, Harry, but even I believe the world is full of miracles and marvels, and hold faith that all will be well in the end. And that's the end of chapter 13. So that's all for today. I hope you'll come back tomorrow for the next chapter. Stay well, get lots of rest, wash your hands, and we'll see you soon. Bye.